Hi, welcome to Historically Speaking. I'm your host, Lori Roberts, and today our show is going to be about the Underground Railroad. And we have a special guest, Pamela Horner.
Hi.
Welcome. Thank you for
Thank you for
coming
having
today.
me.
I'm going to get with Pam here in just a minute. We're going to talk about some things that she has done some research on pertaining to a book that she has written. But I'm going to kind of give us a little background on the Underground Railroad and kind of catch us up to where we left off with our last show. And if you've been following our sequence, our last show was about the massacre at Fall Creek. And that ended around 1826. So we're going to jump ahead to the next couple of decades to about 1835, 1840s. And we're going to start off with what actually was going on in Indiana and also in the country during that time. And so, of course, if you know your history, the country was being divided over slavery. And at this time that we're talking about, the abolitionist movement had just started. And so people like Lyman Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and I have her book that we're going to talk about here in just a minute, Uncle Tom's Cabin, that had just not quite been written yet, but the people who are in the book, the subject matter, their lives were coming into play. So what was the Underground Railroad? Well, let's dispel the myths. First of all, it wasn't a railroad, and it wasn't underground. So let's conquer the first word as far as underground. That means it was secret. So when the Underground Railroad began, the best way to get your slaves out of the South was to do it in secret because the fugitive slave law had passed and there was a bounty on slaves, so it became very important that the slaves got help and found a way to get out of the South without being brought back. And it was horrible to be brought back because you knew you were going to be sold further south or downriver. So how did they get north? Well, they walked, which was the way most of them did. They rode on horseback if someone would take them. One of the ways was hiding in a false-bottomed wagon. That was one way. And my favorite was Henry Box Brown, who actually mailed himself north. He wanted to go north, so he built a box and he put himself in it and put the address of where he was going to go. And he put his address to an abolitionist who lived in Philadelphia. And Henry Box, do you remember that story?
I love that story.
He got in the box, and of course he had a little air hole, and he goes north. And he gets to the train station where the box is going to have to be transported, and they unload it, and it sets and it sets. Oh, and he's inside the box, and finally someone goes and sees the name that's on the box, and they go fetch the fellow and say, you've had a box down here all day waiting on you. Poor Henry, he just about suffocated, but he made it to freedom. So, I mean, the desire to be free was so strong in the slaves that they were willing to risk mailing themselves, but also taking such a chance going on the Underground Railroad. So you could go by water, and that meant the Ohio River, and we're going to talk more about that here in a minute. Who brought the slaves north? Everybody's pretty aware of Harriet Tubman, who was known as the Moses of the Underground Railroad. She wasn't actually the first, but she took over 300 people north with her, made several trips, and part of those were her family. The first one that I could find was Tice Davids, and in 1831 he escaped from his Kentucky plantation. He swam all the way across the Ohio River. And his master was on the opposite side of the river. and he was watching him swim. So once he got across the river, he thought, well, now I'll just row across and I'll go find him. But he had disappeared. So he looked all over the town, and some people had heard him say, he must have gone on an underground road. He had to have escaped. And so the story spread, and then the story changed. And because the locomotives had just been built, that was steam engines, people started saying, no, he must have escaped on the Underground Railroad. And so that was the story that stuck, was the Underground Railroad. So now let's fast forward a little bit. We've had slaves escaping, and they've heard about this thing, this Underground Railroad, but you had to have connections, just like in a train station. So they had their conductors, and the conductors were the ones who led the fugitives to the next station. You also had station masters, and these people would feed the fugitives. They would give them a nice warm bed at night, a barn to sleep in, and then they would sometimes alert the next station master that they were going to have slaves coming. And so there were certain signs. Some of them included knocks at the door, and there was a certain number of knocks would mean that somebody was at your door. They would sometimes send a message, as I have sent at 2 o'clock 4 large and 2 small hams. And that basically would be there were going to be 2 adults and 4 children coming at 2 o'clock on the train, and you would have to be down there to meet them. Sometimes the fugitives travel without a conductor, and in that case, you really didn't have knowledge of who exactly you were going to be staying with. And so there were secret signals. Sometimes they would go down and wait at the boat dock, and if they saw a man spread ashes on the ground, then that would mean it was safe to get on board on his ferry or whatever. My favorite, and I don't know if you've noticed too, Pam, have you ever seen the little stone statues? Sometimes they call them lawn jockeys. Mm-hmm. All right, well, for a long time, I didn't really know what those were, and I'd heard people kind of say they were, derogatory. You really didn't want those in your yard. And then I started doing some research, and I thought, well, surely if they're all up here in the north, they wouldn't have been derogatory, I wouldn't think. So I did some research, and I found out that actually started with a woman who was in the north, and she was married to a judge, and she was an abolitionist, but the judge wasn't. Oh. So when the slaves would come, she would use her statue that was out in the front of this little boy. It was a stone statue, and in his hand, you could put flowers or whatever, but she would put a flag. And so if the flag was up, that meant that her husband wasn't home, and the flag would welcome them into the home. But if the flag wasn't in his hand, that meant the judge was home, keep going. And so I liked that one. I also like the one where women here in Indiana, especially the Quakers, would put their quilts on the line. Yeah. And there were certain patterns in the quilt, and they would usually point you on kind of like a road map, how to go to the next safe house. I'd also heard that if the pattern was facing the road, that you knew it was safe. But if the quilt was turned the opposite direction, then it wasn't safe, and you shouldn't stop at that safe house or that station. So those were some of the things that people had to learn. I mean, if you were going to be successful and get north, which is where we're coming into today's story, north was Indiana, Ohio. Yeah. And so, Pam, why don't you kind of catch us up to speed on, you had done some research on a book.
Yes.
Okay, well, why don't you tell us about that?
Okay, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. I have highly enjoyed watching your program.
Oh,
it's been really, really successful and enjoyable. So I appreciate this opportunity. And I did some research on the Underground Railroad. Particularly, my focus was Madison, Indiana. Mm-hmm. and because they have done an exquisite job of preserving the historical aspect of that town. And it is so old and so rich in history, and it's just magnificent. And Madison had really a front row seat for the Underground Railroad, because at the point where Kentucky's edge meets the Ohio River and then, faces Madison, well, that's a fairly, for the Ohio, fairly narrow part of it, and in some areas not quite as deep as it, gets further up and down the river.
And this is a good picture we took the day we kind of did our little tour, and to me it was almost like you could see how people would want to cross there, because it wasn't as wide as some parts of the Ohio River either.
So they had such a good opportunity to utilize that advantage, nature's advantage, to try to get them across as quickly as possible. And so I thought, okay, I would like to utilize, the whole Underground Railroad and Madison's part in it, because so many people were integral in the Underground Railroad. And they are unique because they had a section of Madison called Georgetown.
And I would just hold that up as well.
Yeah, that's the plaque from Madison that kind of heralds Georgetown and its contribution.
Yeah, and there were two. And is George, I couldn't find anything as far as when I was reading the different placards and whatnot. It's interesting how some of the names of the towns where the slaves went had a special meaning.
Right. The only thing I could find is one of the earliest settlers in Georgetown was a free black named with the last name George. And so they feel that that's probably where the name of the town originated.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And so Georgetown started, not just started, but as early as we have records is around, I think it was, hang on just a second, let me grab my specs. I believe it was 1820s. Yeah. There were 48 African American families around the 1820s that we know of at the time. And then the population continued to grow because it was such a unique opportunity. And it hit its heyday around 1850.
Okay.
And then there was a decline. But by 1850, it was close to 300 families of African Americans. It was 298 families that were, at least that we have record of. And it was a fantastic opportunity for free African Americans, but it was not a walk in the park by any means. There were so many dangers still, because they still had a lot of pro-slavery people, residents in Madison, who would attack them and raid their homes looking for slaves, just giving them trouble. People from Kentucky, slave catchers, would come over all the time. So they had this, but they still weren't by any means really safe.
Right, and so the Fugitive Slave Act had been passed, I think, about 1850. So that was getting about the time where the population was at its largest. So I can imagine that slave catchers would target these river towns, especially because they knew they were going to be probably milling about and would have an easier time finding.
Right, and they did. And there were some people who had lived in and around the Madison and Georgetown area. They were actually forced to leave, but they didn't discontinue the work, which was like, I thought, oh my gosh, because I would have been so tempted to say, you know what, I think I'm going to go a little further north. Bye-bye. It's every man for himself. But they weren't. I do have a few names of and this, oh my goodness, this is just the tip of the iceberg of some of the notable people that I found in the Madison, Georgetown area. Let me take a look. One was George D. Baptiste.
Now, was this his home?
I believe that might have been. I hate to say for sure, but
I
I think
this
it was.
is the one that we looked at in Georgetown. And it reminds me of, the federal style homes that you would
Right.
have seen in Philadelphia and Boston. And
Right, and a lot of the houses in Georgetown were the federal style, whereas if were looking at the rich, the very, very wealthy families, they were more toward, especially the really wealthy, were more toward the river, so they could really showcase their mansions, and they were more, for example, Greek Revival.
Okay.
But I love that federal
Yeah,
style
that
of
was really
house.
pretty.
He was one, George de Baptiste was one who actually, I'm looking through, yes, he did leave and move to Detroit, but that did not detour his work. He continued helping the slaves escape. He was a free black from Virginia.
Okay.
And he actually challenged an 1831 law that was in place where if you were a free African American, you needed to pay, I think it was $500 to Indiana to live in the state.
Yes.
And he challenged it. Now, he won, but it was only on a technicality, and so the law was still in place. But that was such a thing of note that
Right.
he even went up against that. And something I thought you might be interested in, because you have done so much research in William Henry Harrison.
Oh, uh-huh.
Right? Okay, so George de Baptiste served as a steward of the White House under William Henry Harrison when he was
wow.
president, which I
Okay.
thought was really interesting. And then after that sojourn, he returned to Madison, assessed the situation, saw what was going on, and knew he needed to really get into this. So he opens up this barber shop. And what's interesting is the barber shop was it was like the hub of activity for Underground Railroad. So, you could kind of go there and find out what was going on. Now, and violence actually did run him out of town, because why stay when you know you're going to lose your life?
Right.
Where he could move, and did, to Detroit, further north, away from some of the more violent mobs that were attacking Georgetown, and still continue the work.
Yeah.
So another person of note that I had down was William Anderson.
Now, I've heard of him, but I can't remember
Okay,
what he was doing.
we saw the church.
Okay. Now, the church that we tried to crash.
We actually crashed.
Yeah, there was another tour going
tour,
on, and this is all that I could get. And it's actually in stone where it says the AME Church, founded 1850, and AME, several churches in this area that were started by maybe freed slaves or African Americans that came into this area, and the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which this church, and I'm just sorry that I didn't have the picture to show, but I think I did send the picture, so maybe by the time we see the show, we'll be able to get a picture of it on here.
I believe we were probably so startled that we had, just kind of burst in on the scene right in the middle of that tour group. We probably just backpedaled as quickly as possible and got out of there and forgot to do anything else. He was a slave who had a pretty daring escape. I think he jumped off of a steamboat and in the Ohio River and swam to Madison and settled in Madison. Yeah. So he escaped his slaveholder, and he learned the trade and built those two churches. And what was really notable about the one on 5th Street, the African Methodist Episcopal, they were, slaves weren't allowed an education, of course. Everything had to be done surreptitiously. And so they went ahead and held a school in the basement of that particular church, which I thought was really neat. And he was very active in the Underground Railroad and as an abolitionist. Now, unrelated to him, but same last name, is Elijah Anderson.
Okay.
Okay. And he had worked with William Anderson and de Baptiste as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Now, what was really interesting, and then he also has kind of a mystery attached to him.
Yeah, tell us about them. I'm all about mystery.
I knew you would like that part of it. He was actually very light-skinned. He was very, very light-skinned, to the point where he could pass as Caucasian, and did. He used that to his advantage. So he would go in as if he were a slave owner and gather up slaves and then transport them as if he were taking them north for himself or for, for another, slaveholder. And he was captured. He actually took them, helped them go all the way to Canada. But he was arrested in 1856 for transporting slaves on a steamboat. And he was sentenced to 8 years in a Kentucky prison. And the mystery is actually about his death, because the day before he was to be released in, I believe, was it 1861? The day before he was to be released in 1861, he was found dead in his cell of mysterious circumstances. But didn't that also coincide with the beginning of the Civil War?
When the war started.
And I just wondered if they realized that he probably was not going to stop his work, and so they silenced him forever.
Right.
And then the Chapman Harris, I thought, was really interesting. Now, he did not live in Georgetown. He lived in Eagle Hollow, which I believe is 3 miles east of Madison. Okay. He had always heard about Georgetown and living in Madison area as a free African American. So he moved his family to Indiana. And he was a blacksmith by trade. So he, and I believe it was his 2 older sons, they all 3 worked together on the Underground Railroad. And what he would do was he situated an anvil in a trunk of a tree. And so whenever they were free, and it was safe to take as safe as it could be, to take the skiff to the Kentucky side and pick up the slaves and come back, he needed to let them know that they were on their way. So he would take a hammer and sound the alarm, that we're coming. And then he and his sons would take the skiff over, pick them up, and that's how, they realized that they would be safer that way.
Now, I can't remember who it was, but when we were talking before, you had toured a home, and what sticks out in my mind was, I don't know why it dawned on me, but I thought about The Hiding Place, the movie The Hiding Place, and then I thought about the Jews and how they, would hide, or the people would hide the Jews during the Holocaust. And there was a house that you had told me about where there was some kind of hiding place or hiding room, and I know they use those a lot, but do you remember when we talked about that? Okay.
I was on a tour of the historical part of Madison during their Christmas tour of homes, and it was one of the homes on that tour that the guide had mentioned that they really feel like one of those rooms was used as a hiding place. Well, unfortunately, because I sometimes have a tendency to be like a child, I was all like, "Blah!" And then I started talking like to the people in the group. Oh my goodness, I wish I could go back and do that over, because I missed some of what they were saying. And I know the whole group was like, could she be removed, please? So I did miss some of that, but I was so excited because that was the year I had started the research. So I was like, ah. But while I was doing, not that same night, ousted out, but another time I was at the library, and I've brought this just horribly crude drawing, which actually is one of my better masterpieces. I came across some research about a house that was considered to be a safe house on the Underground Railroad. And if you'll give me just a second, I have the name. It's called the Todd House. Okay, and his name was John B. Todd, and I believe it's in the area of what they refer to now as Clifty Hollow.
So like where the falls and all that
I'm
are?
assuming so.
Okay.
I had found that it was in the area of Clifty Hollow. Now, here's the picture that I drew from the article that I had found.
Which I think is pretty good.
Well, I hate to be cocky, but for me that is like,
well,
kind of like a Rembrandt for me. It's a little
is
better than a stick figure. But it was the fireplace in which they would hide, where there was this false, like the flue is going up here, so they could hide the slaves in this area. And if you looked at it from both the outside and the inside, of the house and just looked straight at the fireplace, you wouldn't have known it. And what they would do, they would pry up they had some, wooden planks, and they would pry them up, and the slaves would crawl up that way and stay in here. Now, that sounds amazing, and I was like all about it. But then when I researched more, I was somewhat taken aback and quite horrified, because while he did put his life, obviously, at risk doing this, he would keep the slaves there for a day or so, whatever, and wait to see if there was a reward for them. And I was like, are you kidding me? But that's the way of it. And if there was, he would turn them over and then split the reward with the sheriff in that area. If there wasn't, then he would actually help them continue their journey north.
And that was the bad thing about Indiana and some of the states that were like border to Indiana and the Ohio River, because the judges who, during this Fugitive Slave Act, if you caught a runaway, of course they couldn't speak for themselves, but during the hearing where the judges were interviewing, where they came from, they would get $10 for every slave they sent back, but they only got $5 if the slave was actually a freedman, or it wasn't the one they were looking for, so they couldn't take him back. And that makes me wonder if maybe the judge and he had a system.
I would say you're probably right. I just read that and I was so disappointed, but then I thought, that was such an eclectic mix.
Yeah.
You really didn't know who you could trust. So can you imagine the African Americans taking that risk, staying there, not knowing if they were going to be turned in or not?
Well, and you had, you had the Quakers, you had other freed blacks that were part of the Underground Railroad. What about the uber wealthy people who lived? And what comes to my mind is that big mansion that you see if you're coming across the river.
My favorite.
The Laniers. How did they figure in? Do you care to tell us a little bit about that?
Honestly, what little I know, I'll be happy to share. But when I first started doing, look at that, oh my goodness.
Isn't that gorgeous?
They call it the crown jewel.
Now this
of
is
the
the
Ohio
back
River.
of the house, if I'm not mistaken, or is that the front? No, that's the back. This is how nice the back of the mansion was.
Which is the lesser of the two, if you can imagine.
Now this is the more opulent front view from where the street is, but of course as you're looking down, you're at the river.
And they wanted the nicer part of the house facing the river.
It's just amazing how, and this is one where I'm standing more up and you can actually see the river from like the portico and the manicured gardens. I mean, this reminds me of something you'd see in, maybe South Carolina or Virginia, not Indiana.
I tell you that I have toured that house, I don't even know how many times, because I'm so obsessed with that house. I just love it, love it, love it. When I started doing the research over this, to begin with, it was for the book, which obviously was going to be set during the Civil War. Well, then when I started researching Georgetown, and I thought, oh no, I realized what they call the heyday of Georgetown was around, it kind of peaked at 1850, and I thought, that's not time-wise, that's not going to work, what am I going to do?
Right.
Well, I kept digging, and then of course the people in Madison were just so forthcoming with help and information. They were so wonderful to work with. But they said, oh no, yes, the population of course did decrease because of the violence, the mobs. I mean, they ran for their lives, literally. But there were people who stayed and people who continued the work all the way through the Civil War. So, so I was okay. And I had wanted to make my setting, not only Madison, but specifically, I wanted my main characters to be in the Lanier Mansion. Of course, I changed the name to Lawrence Mansion. And
do you have the cover of your book that we could show how?
I just happen to have.
Do you have that?
Yes, I do.
Maybe you could so they could see.
Yeah, this is a picture of the Lanier Mansion that I used. And,
Looks really nice.
thank you
for
so
their
much.
cover.
I just, if you ever are in Madison, please take the tour. You will not regret it. It's
a beautiful
very
home.
interesting and very beautiful. And Mr. Lanier, I believe he commissioned it to be built, I'd say probably late 30s into around 1840. And so the Lanier family lived there 1840, 1850. Now, he
Okay.
actually moved away and actually went to New York.
Okay.
But he was active still aiding in the Civil War. And I have some things that I wrote down from one of the tour guides had mentioned. And you'll know more about this. I had just written down that he had given $640,000 to Indiana to help out against Copperheads.
Oh, yes.
Now, Copperheads,
Those were the Democrats who were still, let's see now, those were the people who lived in the area who were Democrat but didn't side with
okay. So he gave quite a chunk of money. If you can imagine $640,000 then, like I can't even imagine what that would be
Right.
today. To keep Indiana in the war effort. And then that was in 1862. In 1861, he gave $400,000 to equip the troops.
Now, did he have a regiment or anything? I meant to.
I believe he was just a civilian
He
who
just
helped
gave.
the war. Yeah,
Okay.
he utilized what he had, which was his considerable wealth. And even though he himself wasn't in Indiana, his son still lived in the Lanier Mansion.
Oh, okay.
And then
Okay.
he had moved to his younger children and his wife, and he moved to New York
Okay.
in the 1850s, I believe it was.
Okay.
And so his part in that was working to help aid Indiana and just the war effort in
Right.
general, the North.
Okay. Okay. So now let's fast forward it. Now you have done your research. You've spent a lot of time in Madison. You've put boots on the ground and you've got your characters. What are some of the things that you put in, you weren't able to put in the book, but found really interesting, in your research that it just didn't fit, but something that you came away with?
Okay, about the Lanier Mansion in
Or just
general?
about your research in general.
There was so, just little things that just tickled me to death that really didn't mean much to, I was just always like, wow, I
Yeah.
just think that's so awesome. I can remember one of the tour guides mentioning that, I want you to look out, they're beautiful windows. Look out at these beautiful manicured lawns and just notice the beauty. And of course, I'm like, ah. And he said, that was not that way at all. Okay, Madison they were so innovative. It was really interesting. They made their money initially on the river, the steamboat trade.
Right.
So, and that was the place to go. That was the happening place. Well, then the advent of the locomotive, right? The trains. Well, they were, okay, well, we're losing out here, and we're losing money, and we're losing citizens, and, we need to jump on something, so they tried the train. Well, Madison has just such steep terrain.
Right.
So they had a railroad, but it was very unwieldy, and it took so much to get it powered up, so that really didn't go anywhere. So instead, they thought, what can we do? What can we do? So they went into what would you say, pig market?
Okay, slaughter.
If you ever really go around Madison, you're going to see these statues, stone statues, painted statues of pigs everywhere.
I didn't know what that was for.
I always wondered, I thought, do they really like their, pork, their pulled pork? Like, what is this? Well, then I did some research and I was like, okay, that's what it's about.
Yeah.
That's where they made their money. They had slaughterhouses. So people would, and which I did actually end up putting that into the book, but people would, use the skiffs or whatever and bring the pigs over, and there was like a pig run across the front yard of the Lanier Mansion. And we would be so mortified at that now, but he said at the time, they didn't think that was stinky, loud, smelly. That was the way of it.
Yeah.
It'd be like our traffic jams that we think really nothing about, and they would be horrified. So I always thought that was really interesting.
That's neat.
And how we take for granted our Febreze and beautiful yards and things like
Probably
that.
didn't notice any other new smell because everybody smelled anyway, you know.
Right,
We just didn't
yes.
have the hygiene that we have
Yes.
today, so that was different.
So I really enjoyed, you know, little things like that. And then there are all kinds of interesting things about the building of the Lanier Mansion. Like they have just such a glorious staircase. They have just some of the architecture of the time was really interesting. Like some of their doors are actually rounded somewhat.
It's kind of bowed,
Yeah.
like a bow.
Right. So if you're like in this room, it's more like this type of situation instead of just the straight. Why, I'm not really sure, but it's gorgeous and it looks right.
Maybe just trying to use every inch of space that,
I would say so.
that they had.
When you're looking at the first floor, I believe, I may be wrong, it's either 12 or 14 feet high, the ceilings. And because that's where people would come in, and you want them to see how opulent, how, you know, wonderful everything is. And then the higher up you go, the lower the ceilings until you're at the third floor, which was where the servants would stay, the children would stay, you know, the younger children. And I think those they might have been 6 or 7 feet high.
Now that was right around the top part of the, okay, all right.
Yeah.
And not as big a, well, and you scaled it down as you went up, you know, you didn't have as many panes in the windows.
Yeah, you didn't need to put in all of your finery.
Right.
Because that was mainly on the first floor where people would actually see it.
Right, that's, a little further up from where Madison is Fountain City, and we had talked a little bit about the Levi Coffin.
Yes.
And
yes.
this is Levi Coffin, who was a Quaker, and so I don't know if he ever had any connection to the people in Madison, but one of the connections that I found out about Levi Coffin was he actually had a connection to Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Oh.
And Uncle Tom's Cabin was written about 1852, and it started out, this book was about slavery, but it started out more for women and motherhood, and Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote the book to show the importance of motherhood and with the slaves. But of course they picked up on the evils of slavery and poor Tom and whatnot. But the connection to this book and Levi Coffin in Indiana is the story of the slave woman who's actually mentioned in Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Eliza, who lived in Kentucky, which reminds me a lot, you know, about the slaves who came here. A lot of them were right across the river from Kentucky. But this Eliza, if you've read Uncle Tom's Cabin or if you've seen the book, she's in the movie and the book. And she escapes with her little boy. But in truth, she and the child, a 2-year-old little boy, were going to be sold. And so she risked everything to cross the Ohio River, but it had frozen over. And the story goes, as she's carrying this little boy, she's stepping across the ice, and the ice starts to break apart. And of course, the current is underneath. And so these flows of ice are moving, so she's trying, and you've seen where people kind of skip the rocks. She's doing that across the Ohio River with this 2-year-old, stepping on ice as the chunks break apart. And a couple of times her one foot actually goes down in the water and comes back up. She makes it across, makes it, you know, and I don't know if she crossed at Madison, but she made it to Fountain City, which is where Levi Coffin and his wife Catherine, who were Quakers, lived. And I don't know how the story got from him back to Harriet Beecher Stowe, but they were both abolitionists.
Right.
But that's the story that she used in the fictional Uncle Tom's Cabin.
I love that so much. And I cannot say for sure about that, but what I'm almost positive, there were three 3 lines from the Ohio River to get north.
Right.
The east, the west, and the central. And Levi Coffin was on the east, which went through Madison.
Okay.
So I would say that has to be the connection.
Yeah.
Don't you think?
I would thought, and I looked at this is a really neat book that if you go to Madison, that they give you.
Yeah.
And what's neat about this book is there are all these maps and whatnot, but when Pam was talking about the different routes, this shows the different walking routes or driving routes that you can take
Yes.
to follow.
Yes.
But they have this book in the gift shop, and it is I mean, this was free. They gave it to us.
Right, yeah.
But, you know, if you're interested, it's the driving tour that you can see a little
I'd
bit
love to
more of
do
the
that.
houses. Uh-huh.
Now, they have different traces that you can take to continue north, wherever it is your head, you know, whether it's Michigan, all the way to Canada,
Right.
you know, Ohio, you know, different traces. So even though it is the east line, it can go different ways. But I read he did not start the Underground Railroad, but he was an organizer of it. Like he was that
He was
important.
a conductor and then some.
Yeah, he was super important on
He
that one.
worked his way up, I guess, into the hierarchy, I guess, of the Underground Railroad
Yes.
here in Indiana. And it's kind of neat because I don't know how, you know, we grew up at the same time, so we both had Indiana history, probably taught the same way, and we learned the same things. And, you know, I don't remember as much learning about the Underground Railroad in our Indiana history class back
No.
then. I mean, we learned about the counties and the Indians and things, but he was new info. I didn't know that much about him.
The Underground Railroad being in Madison, I
No.
don't remember being taught that.
I did not know
That, I went into shock when I
Well,
found out.
When I was teaching in Louisville, we always did the tour down along the Culbertson Mansion, down in New Albany along the river. And there's a church right there on Main Street. I believe it's a Methodist church. And in the basement, they had like a cellar room. And that was where the slaves who came and crossed the Ohio River, and I believe, and I hate to say this, but I'm pretty sure there was a tunnel that they had dug from the bank of the Ohio River
Oh, my
to
goodness.
the basement of this church, which, you know, if the way the crow flies, I mean, it wasn't that far. The river's kind of altered its course. It was a little bit closer than it is today, but that, I believe they found some shackles, a shoe. I mean, there's all kinds of things. And they will let you go down into that room and they'll take you down there to see that. That was one. And then there's a place here south of us in Orange County called Little Africa. And if you're a hiker and you don't mind getting out and mingling with nature and snakes, which that about takes me out of the picture, but I'm going to go. You know, I grew up in Crawford County, so I'd always heard about Little Africa. But if you leave Paoli like you're going towards Marengo on 37, there's a pull-off as you come around, and it's called the Pioneer Mothers Park, and it's part of the Hoosier National Forest. And it's about a 45-minute jaunt, pretty flat.
Yeah.
It's not, you know,
Hideous.
I could probably do it. And it's about 45 minutes, but once you get out there, it's where the slaves who came north stayed, a lot of them before going further north. And there's, you know, you can still see some of the foundations of the houses that they had. And I don't know exactly what all they found, but, you know, that's really close to Lawrence County. So I would think we had Underground Railroad homes here as well. And I'd always
Right.
heard rumors that there were him in Lawrence County, but I don't know. That's probably another show, but.
But not in school. That's why, as we
No.
get older and then we find out, you know, I'm not sure even about high school being taught. You know, I think it was just something that happened to happen upon, you know, out of school. And I thought, oh my gosh, why don't I remember that? And I don't think it was actually
No.
mentioned. Those things are rich.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I always thought we had to go south if we wanted to learn more about that.
And to find out it's in your back door.
Yeah, It's just really, well, I don't want to take up all of our time talking about one thing. I want to get to your book because it goes so well with what we're talking about. Can you tell us a little bit, without giving the whole book away, because
Okay,
the
sure.
whole point
Thank
is
you.
buy Pam's book.
Yes, please. No, the Cry of Freedom is actually a sequel
Okay.
to Acts of Courage. That was actually my very first one that I had written. And it has the same character, but it can definitely be a standalone read. You don't have to read Acts of Courage, though I highly encourage you to. But it has the same main character, Fenn, and he's dyslexic. I wanted to, that was my first push, not just historical fiction, but I wanted to have some awareness opened up because of what my grandson, when he was diagnosed with it, what he has suffered and, just trying to stumble through. So my main character has kind of thought about, well, I don't even know if that really happened. That was a long time ago, and nothing has happened to me since, and he's just sort of gone back into his old ways of being a slug, not fighting the good fight, not trying all those techniques that, that dyslexics have to do to be able to read and be successful and comprehend. So he's failing. Here he is in 8th grade, and they're learning about U.S. history, and he's like, and I don't want to read it. Have you seen it?
I've seen that
We've all seen that. And he's like, I don't want to read it, blah, blah, blah. So he gets into trouble. And while he is in like sort of a detention type situation, he gets whisked back to Madison so that he can really see firsthand what this was all about. And I didn't, even though it's set, obviously during the Civil War, I didn't focus on any battles. This was the battle I wanted to focus on, the battle of the slaves, trying to find their freedom and doing whatever they could to find it. And he gets to see, unfortunately, but actually it was the best thing for him to see firsthand, to get a front row seat of what real bullying looks like. And he meets someone who, Paris, one of my favorite characters, who would give anything to just be able to read so that he could save his own life and the life of his family. And boy, you talk about, like, oh my gosh, here I have all this at my fingertips and I have just been nothing but an absolute, doof. So, I don't know, I felt like I was pulling myself up by my bootstraps, just even writing it. And you just find yourself pulling for Paris and, come on, Fenn, come on. And he, of course, the setting is the Lanier Mansion, but it's the Lawrence house. And he sees what they go through. He sees what it's like, and he sees their humiliation and degradation, but their dignity and their strength throughout all of that. And it was one of the toughest things for me to write, and my niece, I always send it to my daughter and my niece, and make them, you can't leave until you read it. She called, and I've been waiting like this, because she's a very fast reader. I'm like, I don't think she liked it. I don't think she liked it. I would have heard by now. And when she called, she said, other than Mam's book, the Long Road Home, she said, it's one that I had to put it aside, because you get drawn into those characters, and it's horrifying what they went through, and she had to put it aside to try it. She said she felt like the rising of the blood pressure. You just have to, she had to step aside because she felt it so strongly, which I was happy about that, but they did. They went through so very, very much, and I was so grateful to have this in our backyard where I could put that in a book and just try to honor them the best we could.
Well, I thought you did. I read the book. I read parts of it and was trying to work on a book as well. And then I put it back and read it again. And to me, with Fenn in the first book, The Acts of Courage, of course, I love that time period as well. Yeah. So I was, lickety-split going through the book. And this one, I love the era as well, but I was seeing it from a northern perspective, in the north, coming north, whereas a lot of my books are centered in the south. So I learned a lot, and I thought, just keeping what's going to happen to him, and is this Paris going to, what's going to happen. So I think when people grab the book, and adults as well, not just children, adults as well, will enjoy getting the history and seeing how, and you brought in the bullying, which is something that we all have.
It's such a hot button issue.
It is. And just like the dyslexia, that people are familiar with, the learning, having a disability in reading or whatever, I think they'll enjoy seeing how he overcomes the bullying. But is there a way that they can get a hold of you, and we can put it up at the end of the, to get your book? Or?
Yes, thank you. I have copies of all of my books, so you can definitely get a hold of me and get them from me. And I have a website, and I think I think
and we'll
that they
put
have
that up at the end.
Facebook, just Pamela Horner Author on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. You can go to Amazon and just put in Pamela Horner, and my books will come up. And I also sell them at Primitive Porch. As well.
All right. Now, is there anything coming up that does Finn have a next adventure or anything?
I know when I read Acts of Courage to the fourth graders, of course that's set in the Revolutionary War, they always would like to see me do something else. And then I told them, okay, this is done, I have this. And they were like, okay, how about, so they're very interested in him going to different time periods, and trying different things. So I have been thinking about something else with him. Yes.
Well, we've got a whole year to plan for next year, so we'll have you back when you get the next installment. But I just want to thank you so much for bringing, and I know it was hard to kind of rein everything in because we had so much information on the Underground Railroad, and especially on Madison. You've done a lot of work.
Well, thank you. It was so interesting, so I was happy to do this.
Oh, I'm so glad you could do it. And I want to thank Pamela Horner for coming on and being our sage on stage for the Underground Railroad. And our next show, we're going to go about 20 years, which will take us up to the beginning of the war between the states. And my guest is going to be someone who has a tie to the regiment, the Indiana 27th. And our guest has got firsthand knowledge about someone who actually fought in that. Yeah, so I'm excited. So we're going to have that guest, and then the final show will kind of take us up to the end of the 20th, beginning of the 20th century, the end of the 19th.
Oh, that'll be neat.
So we may get the Gilded Age and talk about that time period, which I'm interested in, the Titanic era and all that.
Absolutely.
So anyway, I just want to thank you for tuning in and watching the show and getting to see Pamela's book and the Underground Railroad information that we have. If you're interested, hop over to our Facebook page, Historically Speaking. Drop us a comment or question, and we're going to be doing shows next year. So if there's something you're interested in that you would maybe like to see a show about, drop us a line and maybe we can figure out how we can make that work for next season. So I'm your host, Lori Roberts. Thank you so much for tuning in, and have a good rest of your week.